My name's Jesse Smith from Texas Tech University. And so today I'm going to talk about my study with looking at anxious attachment as a mediator between physical abuse and alcohol use. So thanks everybody for being here. I know it's been a long day already, long conference, but I don't know if y'all remember this, but at one point Jared made a joke about there being this huge divide between Bowen people and attachment people. So where are my attachment people at? All right. We don't really have that big divide, and maybe it's because we don't have as many Bowen people in my program, but anyway, so if you're Bowen people, maybe still try and get something out of this. I don't know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background literature, my research question, the analysis that I did, the results, and then kind of pull it all together. So I like to communicate in memes a little bit, and so today I feel like this is kind of the vibe, right? Stats everywhere. All right, so just to give a little bit of background on the literature, so childhood abuse has been very much linked to later substance use. And I think that that's kind of a good place to start because I think a lot of our experiences in childhood lead to adult outcomes, right? And so attachment has also been linked to physical childhood abuse specifically, as well as like adult substance use. So interestingly, attachment, I found a lot of studies that use adult attachment as a mediator between specifically childhood abuse and lots of different adult like outcomes, such as psychological adjustment, depression and anxiety, and social support, which I thought was really interesting because I feel like it's kind of sort of a little bit related to attachment. So my research question was, does adult attachment mediate the relationship between childhood physical abuse and adult alcohol or substance problems? So, my study used secondary data from our neuroscience lab on campus. That study was looking at people that had substance use problems. So these were people that still had a problem with substances, and also people that considered themselves to be in recovery or had kind of found a way to resolve their substance use problems. And so because it was a neuroscience study, we had kind of a small sample size for traditional analysis, but this is kind of big for a neuroscience study. And I used some of the assessments that they did in addition to the neuroscience stuff. And so the measures that I used to assess physical abuse, unfortunately, it was a single item that said, have you experienced in your lifetime physical abuse from any of the following people? And then it listed off lots of relationships that a person might have had, such as parents, caregivers, spouses, things like that. Anxious attachment was assessed through the relationship questionnaire, which looked at, and the anxious attachment was a subscale of that. And then the alcohol use severity was assessed through the addiction severity index, which is a composite score subscale of that. So this is me running stats. Yes, I am invincible. That's how I feel when I call it the matrix, when it's like running for 3 days, right? When all that code is like flashing, it's like the matrix to me. It's really exciting. So I used M+, and I did a regression with indirect effects. So physical abuse was my predictor, alcohol use severity was my outcome, and anxious attachment score was the mediator or indirect. So the results, unfortunately, did not find indirect effects for anxious attachment. But there was a pretty strong relationship between physical abuse and alcohol use, this direct relationship here. So, what does it all mean, right? So while I didn't find an indirect relationship that included attachment, that direct relationship between physical abuse and alcohol use severity, I think, is a really important finding, because it's while it already exists in the literature, I think it's something that we kind of take for granted, and I think it's important to continue to talk about. Also, just in terms of limitations, the sample size was a big limiting factor here. There was not a lot of power to include other variables in the model, control variables, and I think that really held me back in terms of being able to detect that indirect relationship, because if you look at the previous research, it's almost like a sure thing to me that this relationship exists, because attachment is such a mediator for moderator. Is a mediator for so many different things like adult outcomes, and so I think that it will be for substance use as well. Also, there's measurement issues in terms of the assessing family violence through a single item, I think, is really problematic, just because of, if you're familiar with the family violence literature, there's a lot of perceptual differences when you're assessing for it. And so if I say, have you been physically abused, that question is kind of loaded with a lot of assumptions, and people tend to answer that question very differently, although they may have had similar experiences or very different experiences, right? And so one way to go about it is to assess direct behaviors, or another way to go about it is to address different perceptions, right, of the power and control aspect of relationships and things like that. And so I think including both of those different types of assessments would be a lot more helpful in actually measuring this. And then including control variables. I don't have a lot of demographic data from this sample, but I assume that it's probably pretty homogeneously white and male. And so getting a more diverse sample and then being able to control for those things, I think, would be really important. So in terms of implications, this strong relationship between physical abuse and alcohol use, I think, is really important. And I think that kind of how, as clinicians, what we can take away from this is that we need to be doing more trauma-informed care, particularly in substance abuse treatment. The literature is very, very clear about, particularly for women, trauma-informed care is critical to successful outcomes in substance abuse treatment, but I think it needs to be across the board. And in practice, you find that it's not really the case. And so I think creating more trauma-informed care to deal with these experiences of abuse and trauma are really important to incorporate into substance use treatment, and doing assessments and looking for all these things. And also, even though attachment wasn't really significant in my model, I think it's still important. And so looking at things systemically, right, preaching to the choir here, looking at relationships, looking at social support, which I think social support and attachment have a big relationship too. So the moral of the story is attachment has the potential to be a really important variable in understanding this relationship between abuse and substance use. Thanks a lot. Questions?
How do you make sense of the